The kingdom had always believed that summer was the season when promises ripened beneath the sun. Roses climbed ivory walls, wheat shimmered beyond distant hills, and every breeze carried the scent of blooming gardens toward the towering palace of Ashcombe. Yet no one standing beneath the brilliant sky that morning realized they were about to witness the quiet death of a marriage that had once been the kingdom's greatest love story. The Summer Rose Festival arrived wrapped in dazzling splendor. Hundreds of crimson, ivory, and blush blossoms covered marble arches stretching across the palace gardens. Crystal fountains scattered diamonds of sunlight through the warm air while musicians filled every pathway with graceful melodies. Noble women drifted beneath embroidered parasols and gowns painted with every shade of summer, gentlemen admired polished white stallions pulling jeweled carriages, and children chased butterflies across emerald lawns without understanding history was preparing to change before their innocent eyes. Every invitation had declared that the festival honored the future heir of Ashcombe. Every citizen believed the beloved Duchess would stand beside her husband while the kingdom celebrated the child growing beneath her heart. No one expected anything different. Inside the eastern wing of the palace, Duchess Eleanor Ashcombe stood before a tall mirror while her lady carefully fastened tiny pearl buttons along the sleeves of her pale blue gown. The silk rested gently over the earliest curve of her pregnancy, hardly visible except to those who knew her well. She smiled as her fingers unconsciously lingered over the precious life hidden beneath the fabric. 3 months. Only 3 months. The child was still too small to feel, yet large enough to reshape every dream she carried. She had imagined this day countless times. She imagined her husband placing one protective hand over their unborn baby while introducing the future heir to cheering nobles. She imagined laughter echoing across the gardens before they escaped together beneath flowering trees exactly as they had during the first summer after their wedding. Those memories remained so vivid that she could almost hear his younger voice promising they would grow old watching grandchildren run through those same gardens. Back then, Duke Adrian Ashcombe had loved simple moments more than grand ceremonies. He once spent an afternoon planting roses simply because she admired their fragrance. He once canceled a royal hunt after discovering she had caught a cold. He once whispered that no throne could ever matter more than the family they would someday build. She still believed that man existed somewhere behind the colder face he had slowly begun wearing over recent years. Hope was remarkably stubborn. Outside her chamber windows, palace bells announced the beginning of the festival. Her carriage rolled toward the gardens through avenues lined with cheering citizens waving ribbons the color of summer sunshine. Elderly women blessed the unborn child while little girls scattered rose petals before the horses. Eleanor smiled warmly at every face because she genuinely believed joy multiplied when it was shared. As the carriage stopped beside the palace fountain, thousands turned toward her. Warm applause welcomed their Duchess. She stepped onto polished marble with graceful composure, accepting respectful bows from nobles and affectionate smiles from servants who had watched her quietly improve schools, hospitals, and kitchens throughout the duchy without ever seeking recognition. They admired her kindness as much as her title. Only one thing seemed strange. Her husband was missing. The master of ceremonies hesitated beside the royal platform, glancing repeatedly toward the palace doors. Whispers drifted through the crowd like restless birds. Perhaps the Duke prepared some surprise. Perhaps he wished to make his entrance unforgettable. Eleanor herself felt a flicker of delighted curiosity. Then the great bronze doors opened. Duke Adrian emerged dressed in ceremonial white trimmed with gold. Yet he was not alone. Resting confidently upon his arm stood Lady Vivian Ashcroft, the daughter of one of the wealthiest noble families in the kingdom. Her crimson gown glittered beneath the sunlight, her jeweled necklace flashed with calculated brilliance, and her smile carried the unmistakable confidence of someone expecting admiration rather than judgment. Confusion swept through the gardens. Eleanor's smile faded, though she remained perfectly still. Adrian guided Vivian across the platform until they stood directly before the assembled court. His gaze briefly met Eleanor's. It held neither tenderness nor apology, only weary determination. The orchestra slowly fell silent. Even the fountain seemed quieter. Every noble waited. Adrian inhaled once before speaking with a voice that carried across every corner of the gardens. I have spent too many years pretending duty alone could guide my heart. Nobody moved. I refuse to continue living a lie. The words struck the gathering with visible force. Eleanor searched his face, hoping another sentence would rescue the first. Instead, he reached gently for Vivian's hand. Then he spoke the words that would echo across the kingdom for generations. She is the woman I chose. Silence became almost physical. A little boy dropped his wooden toy onto the marble path. An elderly duchess covered her mouth. Several ladies lowered their eyes, unable to bear witnessing another woman's humiliation. No one applauded. No one breathed. For one suspended moment, the kingdom itself seemed unable to understand what had happened. Vivian lifted her chin proudly, mistaking stunned disbelief for admiration. Adrian waited as though expecting relief instead of horror. Eleanor felt the world narrow until only three sounds remained: the distant splash of water, the frantic beating of her own heart, and the quiet certainty that the future she carried beneath her heart had just been abandoned before it had even begun. She did not scream. She did not plead. Her dignity remained untouched by the cruelty surrounding her. Slowly, she removed the wedding ring that had rested upon her finger since the day they promised forever before God and kingdom alike. The gold had warmed beside her skin for years. Now it suddenly felt impossibly cold. She walked toward the great marble fountain standing at the center of the gardens. Every eye followed her. Without trembling, she laid the ring upon the fountain's smooth white edge where sunlight immediately caught its golden circle. She turned back toward Adrian. Tears shimmered but never escaped. When she finally spoke, her voice remained astonishingly gentle. "Then may she also carry the weight of your choices. No accusation. No bitterness. Only sorrow too deep to become anger." Those words wounded more deeply than any public condemnation ever could. She lowered her head with quiet grace toward the assembled court, gathered the folds of her gown, and walked alone between endless rows of silent spectators. Not one person dared block her path. Many stepped aside with tears filling their own eyes. The musicians looked helplessly toward their conductor. After several painful seconds, duty forced them to continue playing cheerful festival music while the Duchess crossed the gardens beneath bright summer sunlight, making every joyful note feel unbearably cruel. She entered her waiting carriage without looking back. The horses began moving. The wheels rolled slowly across the palace bridge before disappearing beyond flowering chestnut trees lining the royal road. Only then did Adrian realize his hands were shaking. The celebration resumed around him because ceremonies obeyed schedules even when hearts shattered. Guests attempted strained conversations. Servants poured untouched wine. Vivian accepted compliments that sounded hollow. Yet Adrian found himself staring toward the empty road where Eleanor had vanished, unable to explain the strange ache settling inside his chest. He had expected freedom, triumph, perhaps even relief. Instead, the brilliant summer afternoon suddenly felt colder than winter. Long after sunset, when palace servants discovered the royal bedchamber empty, they learned the Duchess had taken only a single traveling trunk and quietly departed the capital forever, carrying nothing except her unborn child and the silence her husband would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. The royal carriage traveled for days before Eleanor finally asked the driver to stop where the paved road surrendered to winding mountain paths. She dismissed the loyal servant with grateful tears, insisting he return before anyone suspected where she had gone. Carrying only one weathered trunk, a small pouch of coins, and the child beneath her heart, she walked toward a valley wrapped in lavender, birdsong, and silence. No banners welcomed her. No servants bowed. For the first time since becoming a duchess, nobody knew her name, and the freedom frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. The valley rested between emerald hills where crystal rivers reflected endless blue skies. Wildflowers painted the meadows in soft purples, golds, and whites, while old stone cottages nestled beneath orchards untouched by noble ambition. The villagers greeted strangers with cautious kindness rather than curiosity. They cared more about whether someone could mend a fence or knead bread than whether they carried an ancient family crest. Eleanor quietly introduced herself simply as Eleanor Hart, leaving the weight of Ashcombe behind with every careful word. An elderly widow named Martha rented her a tiny abandoned cottage beside the village flower market. Its roof leaked whenever rain arrived, the windows rattled beneath strong winds, and ivy crept through broken stone walls, yet sunlight poured across the worn wooden floor every morning. Eleanor thanked Martha with such heartfelt gratitude that the old woman smiled through moist eyes. She had expected complaints from a traveler carrying refined manners, but instead she found someone willing to scrub floors before unpacking her belongings. The weeks unfolded gently beneath warm skies. Eleanor stitched simple dresses instead of wearing silk. She fetched water from the river alongside other women each dawn, learning their names and listening to stories about stubborn goats, generous harvests, and children chasing butterflies through lavender fields. Nobody treated her as someone extraordinary. They simply welcomed another neighbor willing to share laughter and labor. The quiet, ordinary rhythm healed wounds that grandeur had never touched. 9 months after leaving the palace, The first autumn rain whispered across the valley. Labor began before sunrise, filling the cottage with determined breaths and whispered prayers. Martha remained beside her through every painful hour, holding trembling hands while reminding her that every mother crossed this difficult bridge alone yet never truly without hope. As evening sunlight spilled through the small window, a tiny cry filled the room, clear and strong enough to silence every lingering sorrow inside Eleanor's heart. She gathered her newborn daughter against her chest and wept without restraint. The child possessed dark eyes that searched the world with impossible calm and tiny fingers that instinctively wrapped around her mother's hand. Eleanor named her Lily because lilies bloomed with quiet elegance after storms had washed the earth clean. Looking into her daughter's peaceful face, she silently vowed that this little girl would inherit kindness before privilege, courage before wealth, and compassion before power. Winter passed, then spring returned with blossoms dancing across every orchard. Eleanor used the last of her savings to purchase a neglected brick oven beside the flower market. The building barely deserved the name bakery. Its shelves leaned crookedly, flour sifted through cracked floorboards, and smoke escaped from unexpected places whenever the oven burned too hot. Still, every imperfection seemed like an invitation instead of a burden. She rolled up her sleeves each morning before dawn and transformed flour, water, salt, and patience into fragrant loaves that filled the street with comforting warmth. Her bread became famous not because it tasted luxurious, but because every loaf carried genuine care. Farmers leaving for distant fields often discovered fresh bread waiting quietly beside their baskets without payment requested. Elderly widowers found warm rolls hanging from their gates before sunrise. Mothers struggling through difficult seasons occasionally opened their doors to discover milk, bread, and handwritten notes simply reading, "Tomorrow will be kinder." Nobody ever witnessed Eleanor leaving those gifts because she always finished before the first rooster welcomed morning. The bakery soon became something far greater than a place selling food. Lonely travelers rested beside its windows. Children gathered after lessons to learn how yeast transformed simple ingredients into nourishment. Eleanor insisted every child knead dough with their own hands, laughing whenever flour covered eager little faces. She explained that bread rose best when made with patience instead of haste, and the lesson quietly shaped more than recipes. Parents noticed their children becoming gentler with one another after afternoons spent inside her warm kitchen. As profits slowly increased, Eleanor refused to chase luxury. Instead, she purchased young fruit trees from passing merchants. Together with village children, she planted apples beside roads, pears near schools, peaches beside streams, and cherries overlooking the valley. She reminded everyone that they planted not for themselves but for strangers who had not yet been born. The children repeated those words proudly until the entire valley began measuring wealth not by gold but by shade, blossoms, and harvests shared freely among neighbors. Years seemed brighter wherever Eleanor walked. Lily grew into a joyful little girl who greeted every customer by name and believed every elderly visitor deserved the warmest loaf from the oven. Villagers gradually stopped calling Eleanor by her family name altogether. Instead, they affectionately spoke of her as the Lady of Summer because hope always seemed to bloom wherever she appeared. Travelers carried stories of the remarkable valley far beyond the mountains, describing orchards overflowing with generosity and children who never feared hunger. One evening, a wealthy merchant departing with wagons full of bread quietly remarked, "The happiest place in the kingdom was built by a woman with flour on her hands." None of them imagined those simple words were already beginning their slow journey toward the lonely duke who had once believed he had chosen someone else. 4 years passed, yet Ashcombe Palace never recovered from the silence Eleanor had carried away with her. The marble corridors still gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, servants still polished silver until every tray reflected candlelight, and grand banquets continued filling magnificent halls with expensive music. Everything appeared prosperous from a distance. Only those who lived behind the palace walls understood that splendor had quietly replaced substance, and elegance had become an elaborate disguise for steady decline. Lady Vivian delighted in luxury with relentless enthusiasm. Every season demanded entirely new wardrobes stitched from imported silks. Fresh statues decorated gardens already overflowing with marble. Musicians from distant kingdoms performed during lavish feasts where noble guests praised extravagance while ignoring unpaid farmers waiting outside palace gates. Jewel merchants visited almost weekly, leaving smiling with overflowing purses while the royal treasury gradually emptied beneath endless indulgence. Adrian watched much of it without protest. At first he convinced himself that happiness simply required adjustment. He had chosen this future, and pride whispered that admitting regret would expose weakness before the entire kingdom. Whenever unexpected emptiness settled over him, Vivian responded by arranging another celebration, believing glitter could silence dissatisfaction. Yet every festival ended the same way. Guests departed laughing, musicians packed away their instruments, and Adrian wandered echoing corridors that somehow felt lonelier than before the music had begun. Beyond palace walls, quieter changes unfolded with greater consequence. Farmers increasingly refused contracts offered by Ashcombe estates. Skilled blacksmiths accepted work elsewhere. Young craftsmen relocated with their families, chasing opportunities whispered about in mountain villages where honest labor earned fair payment instead of impossible taxes. Merchants traveling through the duchy carried fewer wagons toward the capital each passing season. They spoke instead of bustling marketplaces hidden among lavender fields where generosity created loyalty stronger than noble decrees. During one council meeting, the royal treasurer unfolded parchment after parchment detailing shrinking revenues. Grain exports had fallen. Orchard leases remained unsigned. River traders preferred docking elsewhere. The old man carefully explained that prosperity seemed strangely concentrated within one forgotten valley beyond the northern mountains. Travelers willingly crossed difficult roads simply to visit its flourishing markets before continuing their journeys. Adrian frowned over the reports. "Who governs this valley?" "No lord, your grace," the treasurer answered. "People merely speak of someone they call the Lady of Summer." The title sounded oddly familiar, though Adrian could not explain why. Another advisor added quietly, "They claim no child goes hungry there. Travelers receive bread without payment if they cannot afford it. Farmers share harvests instead of competing. Even neighboring villages imitate their customs." Several counselors dismissed such stories as sentimental exaggeration. Yet the numbers resting upon Adrian's desk refused to disappear. Prosperity never traveled without reason. That evening he stood alone beside the palace fountain where sunlight had once reflected a single abandoned wedding ring. The marble remained flawless, but memory transformed it into sacred ground. He could still hear Eleanor's calm voice carried across warm summer air. 4 years had passed since that afternoon, yet he remembered every word more clearly than conversations spoken yesterday. Time had softened anger but sharpened understanding, leaving him haunted by kindness he had mistaken for weakness. The next morning Adrian made an unexpected decision. He would travel north without royal banners, soldiers, or noble introductions. If one woman truly transformed an ordinary valley into the kingdom's most prosperous community, he intended to understand how. Disguised as a traveling gentleman named Adrian Hale, he carried only practical clothing, modest luggage, and enough coins for several weeks away from court. For the first time in years, no servants anticipated his needs. He saddled his own horse, repaired torn leather himself, and ate simple meals beside roadside inns where strangers discussed weather instead of politics. The unfamiliar freedom unsettled him before gradually becoming strangely refreshing. Several days later, mountain roads opened toward a breathtaking valley overflowing with lavender fields shimmering beneath brilliant sunshine. Orchards stretched across gentle hillsides heavy with ripening fruit. Children laughed while gathering fallen apples without fear of being scolded. Elderly neighbors rested together beneath flowering trees planted close enough to provide generous shade. Every face seemed touched by quiet contentment rather than desperate ambition. Nothing resembled the struggling settlements Adrian had expected. The marketplace hummed with cheerful purpose instead of frantic bargaining. Bakers greeted shepherds by name. Flower sellers tucked free blossoms into customers' baskets. Young apprentices paused their work simply to help elderly visitors carry heavy parcels home. Prosperity revealed itself not through magnificent buildings but through countless ordinary acts of consideration. Drawn by the irresistible fragrance of fresh bread, Adrian followed a narrow stone lane toward a modest bakery overlooking rows of lavender. Warm sunlight streamed through open windows while children's laughter drifted into the street. He stepped inside, brushing travel dust from his coat. Behind a flower-covered wooden counter stood a woman removing golden loaves from a brick oven. Her dark hair rested in a simple braid. Her dress carried faint traces of flour. Peace softened every graceful movement. Without looking up immediately, she smiled warmly and said, "Welcome. Please come inside." Something inside Adrian unexpectedly stirred. When she finally lifted her eyes, they met his with calm kindness untouched by recognition. "Have you traveled far?" she asked. "A considerable distance. Then you must be hungry." She placed a steaming loaf upon the counter before he could reach for his purse. He instinctively offered payment. She gently pushed his coins back. "Bread is free for anyone who arrives hungry. If you still wish to pay, perhaps help someone else tomorrow." The words landed with astonishing force. Nobody in the capital spoke that way anymore. He accepted the bread almost awkwardly. Its warmth filled his chilled hands. Its aroma awakened memories of simpler mornings long forgotten. Throughout the afternoon he remained nearby, watching customers enter and leave with genuine smiles rather than forced politeness. Children embraced the baker without hesitation. Elderly villagers sought her advice before making important decisions. Young couples invited her to future weddings. She remembered every name, every family, every small sorrow carried quietly through ordinary lives. Adrian found himself returning the following morning, then again the morning after. When he noticed broken shelves inside the bakery, he quietly repaired them. He helped unload sacks of flour from passing wagons. He carried baskets for elderly customers. No one treated him as a duke. They simply thanked another willing pair of hands. For reasons beyond explanation, he laughed more during those few days than he had throughout the previous 4 years combined. Yet every smile deepened another mystery. The gentle baker's familiar voice lingered inside his thoughts long after each evening ended, awakening fragments of a forgotten happiness he could almost remember but could not quite reach. On Adrian's 4th morning in the valley, the bakery door burst open before sunrise, and a little girl skipped inside carrying a basket overflowing with wildflowers. Golden light slipped through the windows, catching loose strands of chestnut hair dancing around her smiling face. She could not have been older than 4, yet she greeted every customer with fearless warmth, as though the entire world had already proven itself worthy of trust. "Mama," she laughed, setting the flowers across the counter. "The lavender smells happier today." Eleanor bent to kiss her daughter's forehead. Perhaps because someone remembered to greet it this morning. The child giggled before noticing Adrian arranging sacks of flour against the wall. "You came back." Her delight was so sincere that he found himself smiling before answering. "I suppose I did. Then you're my friend now." She declared it as though friendship required no permission beyond simple kindness. Before Adrian could reply, she had already slipped her tiny hand into his and tugged him toward the bakery door. "Mama, may I show him the orchard?" Eleanor hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Stay where I can see you." The little girl proudly led Adrian through winding paths lined with fruit trees whose branches bent beneath apples, pears, and cherries. She introduced each tree individually, giving many of them affectionate names instead of numbers. "That one is Grandmother Apple because she gives the sweetest fruit," she explained solemnly. "Mama says old trees deserve respect." Adrian laughed softly. "You remember everything your mother says. Because she's always right." The answer struck him with unexpected tenderness. Throughout the morning Lily transformed an ordinary walk into an unforgettable adventure. She insisted he taste cherries still warm from sunlight. She pointed proudly toward rows of young trees stretching across distant hills. "We planted those together. You helped. I dug tiny holes." She stretched her arms to demonstrate. "Mama says little hands can grow big forests." Adrian gazed across hundreds of flourishing trees swaying beneath the summer breeze. Someone had indeed transformed this valley one patient act at a time. Later she challenged him to build a kite using willow branches, scraps of cloth, and twine stored inside the bakery. Adrian admitted he had never built one before. "That's all right," Lily assured him. Neither had Mama until she tried. Together they fashioned a crooked little kite whose tail refused to remain straight. When the afternoon wind finally carried it above lavender fields, Lily clapped with such joyful excitement that nearby villagers stopped working simply to watch her laughter floating beneath the blue sky. For several precious hours Adrian forgot titles, court politics, and empty palace halls. He became nothing more than a man running through wildflowers beside an exuberant child whose happiness required no expensive gifts, only attention freely given. As evening settled across the valley, Eleanor spread a simple cloth beneath an old apple tree overlooking the river. Fresh bread, goat cheese, herbs, honey, and ripe peaches filled the modest supper. Adrian prepared to excuse himself, unwilling to intrude upon their quiet family tradition. Before he could speak, Lily tugged gently at his sleeve. "Will you stay?" He smiled politely. "I don't wish to inconvenience your mother." The child frowned as though he had suggested something impossible. "Mama says lonely people shouldn't eat alone." Silence followed those innocent words. Eleanor lowered her eyes briefly before looking toward Adrian. "If you would like to join us, you're welcome." He accepted almost without thinking. They ate while golden sunlight painted the valley with warm amber light. Lily happily described every customer who had visited the bakery that day, every bird she had spotted beside the river, and every flower she hoped to plant before autumn arrived. Eleanor listened more than she spoke, encouraging every story with patient smiles rather than hurried interruptions. Watching them together awakened an ache Adrian struggled to name. He suddenly imagined another life. One where laughter filled palace gardens instead of echoing through distant memories. One where supper required only honest conversation rather than formal etiquette. One where children measured wealth in wildflowers instead of crowns. As twilight deepened, Lily climbed into her mother's lap, already fighting sleep. Eleanor gently brushed loose curls away from the child's forehead. The simple gesture felt heartbreakingly familiar. Adrian had watched those same graceful hands soothe frightened servants, comfort grieving mothers, and cradle injured birds years ago. A faint breeze lifted the ribbon resting around Eleanor's neck. Something small slipped from beneath her dress. Gold flashed briefly in the fading light. Adrian stared without breathing. Hanging from the ribbon rested a wedding ring. His wedding ring. The tiny engraving inside had been commissioned on the morning of their marriage. No other ring carried those exact intertwined vines surrounding two initials. His heartbeat thundered. Impossible. His gaze lifted slowly toward Eleanor. She noticed where he was looking. For several long moments neither of them spoke. The peaceful sounds of evening seemed impossibly distant. Lily slipped sleepily from her mother's lap and wandered toward nearby fireflies dancing above the grass. Adrian rose unsteadily. His voice emerged little more than a whisper. Eleanor? She closed her fingers around the ring resting against her heart. Then she looked directly into his eyes. Years had softened pain into quiet strength, yet unmistakable recognition now rested within her gentle expression. Yes, she answered softly. Nothing more. Nothing less. The truth required no explanation. Everything crashed together inside Adrian's mind. The bakery. The kindness. The familiar voice. The patient smile. The valley transformed by compassion instead of power. He had been working beside his own wife for days without seeing her. His knees weakened. Then another realization struck with even greater force. He slowly turned toward the little girl chasing fireflies across the meadow. She laughed exactly as Eleanor once had. She carried his dark eyes. She smiled with the same quiet warmth he remembered from another summer beneath palace roses. 4 years old. The child born after Eleanor disappeared. His daughter. The daughter he had never searched hard enough to find. The daughter whose first steps, first words, and every birthday had unfolded without him. Grief unlike anything he had ever known swept through him. He sank to his knees upon the grass, overcome not by royal failure but by personal ruin. The throne still belonged to him, the palace still carried his name, and countless servants still obeyed every command. Yet everything that truly mattered had quietly flourished without him in this peaceful valley. Tears blurred his vision as Lily wandered back carrying a handful of glowing fireflies trapped inside a little glass jar. She knelt beside the stranger she loved without knowing why, gently touched his trembling cheek and asked with innocent concern, "Why are you crying?" "Mama says people only cry this hard when they've finally found something they thought was gone forever." Dawn arrived wrapped in quiet mist, yet Adrian did not leave the valley immediately. Instead, he spent one final morning inside the bakery, kneading dough beside Eleanor in respectful silence. Neither of them pretended the previous evening had not changed everything. Words alone could never bridge 4 lost years, and Adrian understood that apologies offered too quickly often served the guilty more than the wounded. Before departing, he simply bowed his head and said, "I cannot ask you to trust me today. All I ask is the chance to become a man worthy of asking again someday." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Then do not come back with promises." She gently placed a warm loaf into his hands. "Come back with proof." Those words became the measure of every decision Adrian made after returning to Ashcombe Palace. The palace looked unchanged, yet Adrian saw it with different eyes. Endless luxury no longer appeared impressive. He noticed tables overflowing with food while villages struggled through poor harvests. He noticed polished gardens where flowers bloomed only for decoration while children elsewhere needed orchards instead. Most painfully, he recognized how many years he had mistaken wealth for greatness. The following week he dismissed nearly every extravagant celebration scheduled for the coming year. Jewels commissioned for the palace were sold. Imported statues were auctioned. 3 lavish hunting estates were purchased by neighboring families after Adrian ordered them placed on the market. Several noble advisors protested furiously. "You are weakening the dignity of the duchy," one argued. Adrian calmly replied, "No. I am removing everything that kept me from seeing it." The fortune raised from those sales disappeared almost immediately, not into another treasury but into ordinary lives. Bakers received grants to open community ovens where no hungry family would be turned away. Empty fields became public orchards planted with apple, pear, cherry, and peach trees. New schools welcomed children regardless of wealth. Wells were repaired. Bridges were rebuilt. Village gardens flourished beneath shared stewardship instead of private ownership. Whenever officials praised Adrian for these changes, he answered with the same sentence. I am merely following someone wiser than myself. He never mentioned Eleanor's name publicly. He believed the example belonged to her until she chose otherwise. Lady Vivian watched these transformations with growing disbelief. She demanded new jewels and grand receptions, only to discover those days had quietly ended. One evening Adrian entered the drawing room where she sat surrounded by expensive gowns she no longer wore. I owe you honesty, he said quietly. She looked up without speaking. I confused admiration with love. She lowered her eyes. I know. You deserve someone who chooses you completely. A faint smile crossed her face, sad rather than bitter. And you finally understand who you failed to choose. She rose gracefully, removed the necklace he had once given her, and placed it upon the table. I could compete with beauty, she whispered. I could compete with titles. But kindness leaves no rival. The following morning she departed the palace without scandal, taking only what belonged to her. Neither anger nor revenge followed her departure. Some endings required dignity more than punishment. Nearly a year passed. Summer returned. The anniversary of the festival approached once again. Citizens naturally expected another magnificent celebration inside palace gardens. Instead, royal messengers carried astonishing news throughout the kingdom. The Summer Rose Festival would no longer be held at Ashcombe Palace. It would be celebrated in the Northern Valley. Thousands traveled through mountain roads unlike any procession the kingdom had ever witnessed. Noble carriages rolled beside farmers' wagons. Merchants walked alongside shepherds. Children carried baskets of flowers instead of banners displaying noble crests. Nobody seemed concerned about rank. Everyone simply wanted to witness the remarkable valley they had heard described in countless stories. Lavender stretched toward distant hills beneath endless blue skies. Fruit trees planted years earlier now stood heavy with harvests, their branches offering generous shade to visitors gathering beneath them. Long wooden tables replaced royal banquet halls. Fresh bread emerged continuously from stone ovens while musicians performed among laughing children rather than elevated stages. The fragrance of warm loaves drifted across the valley like an invitation no one wished to refuse. Adrian arrived before sunrise. Not wearing ceremonial robes. Not carrying a jeweled sword. He wore a simple linen shirt with rolled sleeves, sturdy trousers, and an apron already dusted with flour. Without announcing himself, he joined village bakers preparing hundreds of loaves for arriving guests. He kneaded dough beside apprentices barely old enough to reach the work tables. He carried heavy sacks without complaint. By mid-morning his hands, clothes, and face all bore traces of flour, and for the first time in many years he felt richer than any king. Eleanor watched quietly from the bakery doorway. She had received reports all year describing schools, orchards, bakeries, and gardens appearing throughout the duchy. She had dismissed them at first, believing guilt often inspired temporary generosity. But generosity lasting an entire year required something deeper. It required transformation. As crowds gathered beneath flowering trees, village elders invited Eleanor to stand before everyone. She reluctantly accepted, uncomfortable with public attention despite the affection surrounding her. Moments later Adrian stepped forward carrying neither crown nor scepter. Only a simple wooden bread paddle worn smooth from countless mornings spent serving others. He stopped several steps before Eleanor. Then, before nobles, farmers, merchants, servants, and children alike, the Duke of Ashcombe slowly knelt. The valley became completely silent. He lowered his head. When I stood before another crowd years ago, he said steadily, I believed power gave me the right to wound the person who loved me most. I thought greatness lived inside palaces, titles, and admiration. His voice faltered briefly. I was wrong. He lifted the wooden paddle slightly. You built a kingdom without commanding anyone. You fed strangers before feeding yourself. You planted trees whose fruit you knew you might never taste. You taught children that kindness grows stronger when shared. He looked into her eyes. The greatest mistake of my life was believing a throne could make someone worthy. His next words carried across the valley with quiet certainty. You taught me that a home can. He took a careful breath. I do not ask you to return because you were once my Duchess. I ask whether someday, I may become worthy of being your husband again." No applause followed. No one wished to interrupt the sacred silence. Eleanor studied the man kneeling before her. She no longer saw the proud duke who had shattered her heart beneath summer roses. She saw the flower upon his hands, the humility inside his eyes, the patience that had quietly rebuilt lives instead of demanding forgiveness. She remembered every lonely night after leaving the palace, every painful hour bringing Lily into the world, every morning beginning before sunrise, every loaf kneaded through tears. She also remembered the man who had once planted roses simply because she loved their fragrance. Perhaps that man had never disappeared completely. Perhaps he had simply lost himself. Before she could answer, little Lily squeezed through the gathered crowd carrying 2 small crowns woven from fresh lavender and wild daisies. "I made these," she announced proudly. She placed one upon her mother's head. The second slipped crookedly onto Adrian's flower-covered hair. The crowd laughed warmly. Then Lily reached for both of their hands. "They belong together," she declared with absolute confidence. She gently pressed their hands into one another. This time Eleanor did not pull away. Instead, her fingers slowly closed around Adrian's. Tears shimmered in countless eyes as applause rolled across the valley like distant thunder, growing louder until birds lifted joyfully from the orchards. Children began singing the old harvest song Eleanor had taught them years before. Bakers carried warm bread through the crowd, offering every loaf freely. Musicians joined the chorus while lavender swayed beneath the golden afternoon breeze. As sunset painted the sky with amber and crimson, Eleanor, Adrian, and Lily walked hand in hand through endless rows of fruit trees glowing beneath the summer light. Far away, the palace stood quietly against the horizon, beautiful yet strangely empty. Ahead stretched orchards planted with hope, ovens warmed by generosity, and a future built not upon crowns but upon compassion. Adrian glanced toward Eleanor, and she answered with the smallest genuine smile. It was not forgiveness completed. It was something even more precious, the beginning of a second chance that both of them had finally learned to deserve.